Hello! Today I'm taking a look at one of the most unlikely crossover titles in video games history. On a par with the likes of Marvel vs. Capcom or Battletoads and Double Dragon, the Disney meets Final Fantasy dynamic of Kingdom Hearts materialised as a surprising success, with subtle depth woven into characters and setting and a surprisingly emotive story for a game that, after all, does feature Walt Disney's creations in it. Like many game development stories that have become the stuff of legend, the crossover is said to have begun when Square producer Shinji Hashimoto struck up conversation with a Disney executive in an elevator and somehow managed to court him for a pitch about making a Mario 64-style action game. The reins of the project were swiftly handed over to Tetsuya Nomura, whose stock had gone through the roof after his stint as lead character designer in Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII. And it was Nomura who, under the guidance of veteran series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, crafted the worlds and story of the game that would go on to become Kingdom Hearts. Now, although Sakaguchi was most likely preoccupied with Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy X, and the Spirits Within movie around this time, his advice to Nomura on Kingdom Hearts, and particularly his influence on the story, was quite invaluable to making it as popular as it ended up becoming. Nomura has stated that his initial story and concepting was based on making an age-appropriate game for what he perceived as Walt Disney's target market. So let's say roughly between 5 years old up until early adolescence. And personally, I think this would have been an error, as not only would it have limited the scope for the game's audience, but it also would have contradicted what we find even in traditional Disney movies, which is to say, there's often themes and humour applicable to adults as well as their children. You know, taking random examples, we have Robin Williams' Genie doing Jack Nicholson impressions, and we have Potato Head from Toy Story rearranging his face to reference Picasso, which of course would sail over the head of most 6-year-olds, but are prime examples of how, you know, Disney should be a universal and applicable subject matter to use. And, you know, the video games particularly, and particularly Square video games, are applicable to adult audiences as much as they are for children. And the moral centre of Kingdom Hearts is morality and friendship, and the literal utilisation of the power of the human heart. And this is a universal theme, I think, that can be applied to adults and children alike. You know, much like the concept of the Force that made Star Wars so appealing, the battle between light and dark in Kingdom Hearts crafted a solid foundation for its characters and events that take place. And personally, I think it created some really emotive and self-reflective moments. Particularly as well with the more imperfect and conflicted characters we see in the game, such as RIKU, who is among my favourites, and I'll talk about him in detail later. Now, the thematic backdrop of lightness of the heart denoting goodness, and, you know, the darkness and the heartlessness which denotes badness, this is a thorough example of a yin and yang narrative, and we have these excellent and iconic enemies in the form of the Heartless and ANSEM on the one hand, and Sora, Mickey, and the inhabitants of the Disney worlds on the other, which becomes increasingly blurred and artfully complex as the layered dreamscape of narrative and characters evolve throughout the series as it goes on, and it becomes quite Philip K. Dick and surreal in many places, I think. But beginning at the beginning, the game starts like many Final Fantasies, which is to say we're in a small microcosm of existence. In this case, we're on Destiny Island, where seemingly confusing and foreboding events start to take place and transpire towards these macrocosmic plot twists and revelations. The early overtures made by ANSEM, for example, and these voiceovers saying the world has been connected and stuff like that, combined with the gameplay onboarding sequence, which takes place on this beautiful stained glass motifs of the Disney princesses, instantly posits this game as much more than simply a children's story, and it shows a much more ominous and foreboding moral dimension to Kingdom Hearts, compounded by the music score, Enter the Heart, which is a really unsettling choir piece utilised throughout the game, and it's, you know, it immediately conveys this darker tone despite the inclusion of Disney characters here. You know, pushing on with this ominous and thematic quality of Kingdom Hearts, I think, more intangible meta themes and plot points are apparent throughout the game, such as sleep and dreams and heart and emotion, and it gives this game some subtlety and some depth that subsequent installments, as I've kind of mentioned, like the parallel universe vibes of the Heartless and the Nobodies, really has you questioning reality itself by the time the second game rolls around, and we have this whole Roxas dimension, and later reveals regarding ANSEM as a doppelganger. So this meta-thematic and surrealist dynamic is apparent right from the opening moments of the first game. The opening FMV sees Sora floating in water, stating, I've been having these weird thoughts lately, is any of this for real or not? Which instantly sets the tone for the weirdness that kind of transpires over the next few games. Now, digressing slightly and distilling this down, and without wishing to get too heavy too soon, we could interpret Kingdom Hearts as a game that flirts with the entire philosophy of reality and consciousness, and rather than a chirpy, superficial Disney game, it does boil down to the essential questions that have bugged philosophers since the time of Thales. How do I know that I'm awake? How do I know that this is real? And what does it mean to be real anyway? The doppelgangers in the form of Heartless and Nobodies in later games explore this more thoroughly, as I've already mentioned. And although I will go into detail with these ideas once we get to that game, I want to briefly mention the philosopher David Kellogg Lewis, whose work is really applicable to the worlds and realities of Kingdom Hearts, I think. Now, Lewis was an American philosopher who developed an idea known as modal reality, which is inherited in part, I think, from the work of Gottfried Leibniz. And Lewis basically contended in his idea that all possible worlds do exist, and versions of individuals exist across these multiple possible worlds, similar to the scientific notion of the multiverse, which we see in pop culture today. So yeah, we have this slightly altered versions of worlds and beings that exist in an array of altered states. The philosophical contention here is along mathematical principles, such as if infinity exists in science and mathematics, then it's also applicable to matter and space-time. And people more intelligent than me kind of grasp the algebra of this, but suffice to say, for the purposes of this reference, Kingdom Hearts actualizes the idea of possible worlds through Disney set pieces, but also the idea of possible individuals by having Nobody and Heartless versions of key characters, such as ANSEM and Sora. And again, these are explored more in later games, but are established very convincingly in Kingdom Hearts 1. And finally, a final digression. Anyone that's an avid book reader might see some parallels here between these ideas and the novelist Philip Pullman's Dark Materials trilogy, particularly the second novel, Subtle Knife, in which the heroes are able to carve openings in space-time to alternate dimensions. So yeah, that's a book I'd highly recommend to anyone interested in theology, philosophy, and coming-of-age adventures as found in Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy. The ominous dimension of Kingdom Hearts and its Twilight Zone-esque feeling is also augmented by the game worlds feeling like ghost towns, due to what we can probably assume is people hiding or having been consumed by Heartless. Traverse Town in particular, as the first outpost that we visit, has a beautiful musical accompaniment that juxtaposes with this sense of loneliness and foreboding by the lack of inhabitants, except of course a few Final Fantasy characters including Squall or Leon, and Sid Highwind. It's also curious how, despite mentioning his parents in cutscenes, Sora's homeworld of Destiny Island seems deprived of inhabitants, and particularly adults, apart from RIKU, KAIRI, and some Final Fantasy characters as well. So my early impressions of this were due to thinking that, maybe perhaps there was limited development capacity or space for the PlayStation 2 to kind of populate these worlds. But regardless, whether this is the case or intentional, the absence of people really does add this certain style and surrealistic mood and dreamscape quality to the game that ultimately works very well, I think. On the note of the worlds, one of the cool gameplay dynamics is how each Disney world permits you to include the hero of that particular Disney movie in your party. You know, Tarzan in the Jungle World or Aladdin in Agrabah, for example. And I was talking about this with my friend today, in fact, as I've been playing back through these games. And he was of the opinion that you should be able to keep the characters in a permanent selectable party, like other Final Fantasy games, you know, once you discover them. Which, on the one hand, would be quite jarring to see Tarzan in Halloween Town, for example. But on the other hand, could be quite beneficial, you know, rather than kind of, you know, leveling this character that can only be used in one place. It would be nice if you could transfer them across, you know, the global scape of the game. So this is one of the minor gripes of Kingdom Hearts gameplay, along with the heinously bad camera angles in the first game during action sequences, and the quite flaky jump ledges factor where, you know, there's no grab capability, so you either kind of hover on or you hover off and you're always slipping off ledges, which is, you know, really quite annoying. But that said, the gameplay is fundamentally brilliant, I think, and the conventional HP MP gauges of JRPGs combined with the hack and slash action of a platform game produced a really interesting and, I think, successful juggle between the RPG party management and automation and the hero's maneuverability and you know, action qualities. I think that was a really nice marrying of conventions that Square employed here, and of course they've subsequently introduced it across Crisis Core, Final Fantasy 15, and the 7 remake by the looks of it. So, returning to the world and setting here, the collection of Disney environments on offer in Kingdom Hearts are really quite ambitious, I think, for the time. And to detail here, we have Alice in Wonderland, Tarzan, Nightmare Before Christmas, Pinocchio, Aladdin, Peter Pan, Little Mermaid, Winnie the Pooh, and my personal favourite, Hercules. And of course, you know, looking now at Kingdom Hearts 3, which boasts the PlayStation 4 generation graphics and, you know, these Pixar animations, including Monsters, Inc. and Toy Story, contemporary gamers would be forgiven for being somewhat underwhelmed by this first game in hindsight. But it's prudent to note that for the PlayStation 2, you know, rendering these Disney characters as well as they have, with such faithfulness and clarity to the source material, was absolutely awesome to see. And I think actually, looking at the game today and playing the game today, is still, you know, for the most part, does hold up. Particularly visualizing, you know, the Disney characters in the art style in which the actual original films were made. As I noted earlier, each world brings its own hero into the fray, such as Jack Skellington or Tarzan, and also replicates the art direction and aesthetics of their respective movies, to the extent that Sora, Donald and Goofy are often altered in appearance, such as in Halloween Town, where they become vampirical and zombified to slot neatly into that setting. There's also a variety of gameplay mechanics specific to each world, such as swimming in Atlantica, sliding down trees in the jungle sequence, and flying in Neverland, which prevents the game from ever getting stale. Now, turning to consider story, the premise of Kingdom Hearts and the concept of having disparate Disney worlds within a universe is broadly quite simple and effective in terms of the plot. Each world in the Kingdom Hearts universe has a heart, which is accessed through a gateway. The Keyblade wielder is capable of sealing or unlocking said gateways to the hearts of these worlds, and sealing them against the Heartless, primarily, who want to devour them, which is basically Sora's job throughout the events of the first game. We also have the Disney princesses, whose hearts each combine to open the fabled world of Kingdom Hearts, which we learn is the end goal of ANSEM, Maleficent, and the other Heartless. Which, in discussing the first game only, is basically all we really need to know, and although this is left on a cliffhanger and opens itself out into a, as I've said, kind of surrealistic, you know, sort of sequel, the long-term objectives and, you know, the lore regarding the Keyblade is explored much more later on. But in establishing this self-contained premise and contextualizing the world and context of Kingdom Hearts, this initial game and this initial story works really well to opening out the wider narratives that come later. Taking a step forwards into the story, the themes I've mentioned previously, such as heart, courage, morality, the metaphor of light and dark, are compounded by a common trope found in JRPGs and media, which is that of friendship. The entire purpose of Sora's journey is to salvage his two friends, KAIRI and RIKU, from the clutches of darkness, and indeed this mission supersedes the Keyblade world-saving mission early on, and his two new friends, Donald and Goofy, are also striving to find their own friend, King Mickey, before the almost incidental world-saving quest becomes the focus later on, once we meet Leon. The friendship dynamic works well in its light-hearted nature, and each of the characters has idiosyncrasies and three-dimensionality that makes them interesting in dialogue with one another and, the wider cast of Disney characters. Sora is clumsy and optimistic, Donald is anxious and short-tempered, Goofy is warm-hearted and courageous. So each of these characters contrast slightly with one another's demeanours and opinions, which is good because it creates amusing scenarios and interesting discourse and friction between them, albeit in a good-natured way. But on top of this, the fundamental good-naturedness of this trio of heroes is contrasted very well with the existential void and emptiness of ANSEM and his Heartless, and of course the conflicted allegiances of RIKU later in the game. So, turning to the characters now and looking first at Sora, this guy is interesting as an anomaly, particularly when you first load up the game, because he fits neither into the Disney nor the Final Fantasy series, and simply hovers nomadically around these two distinctive franchises. Indeed, when Nomura first conceived of the game, he intended Mickey or Donald to be the main hero, and it was only after issues writing both of those characters convincingly that Sora came into being, which, in my opinion, probably salvaged this game from some frustrating voice acting and unconvincingly emotive plot lines, because, I just can't picture Donald Duck carrying a game of this weight, to be honest, But it also creates a third world, if you like, and I think the cast of Kingdom Hearts can be divided into three camps, which are Disney, Final Fantasy, and Kingdom Hearts specific characters, which ANSEM, Sora, RIKU, etc. firmly sit within. And it does a great job of balancing the novelty of Disney and the novelty and cameos of Final Fantasy to something specific within the Kingdom Hearts universe. And rather than just this kind of novelty game, it becomes quite anchored by having this unique universe within it. Now, as an early teen, Sora's tale is as much a coming-of-age tale as it is a world-saving quest. A distinct aspect of his character is youthful optimism and a naivety which contrasts starkly with basically any other character he meets, particularly the world-weary fighters such as Leon, Cloud, Hercules, and of course the main antagonist ANSEM. And while I'm only discussing Kingdom Hearts 1 here, it's interesting to note how Sora matures along with the series too. It prevents his arc and optimistic demeanour from stagnating, and also, much like Harry Potter, the series the content of the series matures along with its audience, and the hero grows up alongside his core audience who were playing this game, from when it was first released. As previously mentioned, Sora's friendship with KAIRI and RIKU is a defining dimension to his personality and agenda throughout the game. As a 14-year-old entering the confusion of adolescence, it's safe to say that Sora's, having a sexual awakening of sorts, which he's not quite consciously aware of. The onboarding sequences, such as competing with Riku on Destiny Island, aren't simply to familiarise the player with the controls. Well, they are, but there's also a subtle narrative rivalry, developing between these two over the affections and the interest of KAIRI. And this manifests later in the game when each one's obsession with saving her becomes clear. And the significance of the palpu fruit, which is said to intertwine the souls of people who eat from it, is a very loaded indication and a taunt from Riku early in the game that Sora wants to eat one and share it with KAIRI. So this sort of coming of age is established, quite early on, and sets up Sora and KAIRI's relationship to develop over the course of the games. Ultimately, the KAIRI angle is a great dynamic to the game, both narrative-wise and emotively. It's not hammed up and romanticised to the extent that Kingdom Hearts becomes a love story per se. Indeed, Sora being a 14-year-old is, he seems very unaware of this rivalry with Riku, and his inclination towards KAIRI is anything, he doesn't see it as anything more than friendship, which it isn't necessarily, but as the audience, looking at the situation objectively, we can sort of see, what's going on. We can see the undulations and the potential for that. But it's also good because it propels the narrative rift with Riku, who is slightly older and slightly more self-aware about these things. And again, Riku's aware in the same play that the players are aware. And it gives us excellent insight, I think, into what's left unsaid in these exchanges throughout the game. In keeping with the coming-of-age aspect of Sora, we have his desire to explore new worlds, stating to the hooded ANSEM early in the game that he's going to learn what's out there. Much like the biological awakening with KAIRI, we have an intellectual awakening as well, and this urge to grow and this urge to adventure coming out in Sora, which is maintained for the entirety of the game and beyond. And it's this innocence and thirst for adventure that prevents Sora from getting tiresome, I think, because mild-mannered and naive characters can often grate, and, for example, Yuna in the first part of Final Fantasy X seems quite flimsy and inept, partly due to Square's historic portrayal of women, but partly because of her character arc, which is this development into confidence. But with Sora, we see someone who quickly adapts to any situation he's in, whether it's waking up in Traverse Town or entering a new Disney World, which is a good and compelling pace for the character and for the player, who's controlling him. Now, I've said this numerous times, particularly when discussing Cloud and Squall from the Final Fantasy games, but I consider the protagonist's weapon as important and as unique as the protagonists themselves in a lot of ways. The hero's weapon is emblematic of their status within the game world and narrative, and in many ways defines both them and the world setting we find ourselves in. For example, Squall's hybrid gunblade bridges the archaic sorceresses and magical elements of Final Fantasy VIII with the technology and the futurism of its setting. Turning to Kingdom Hearts, this contextual importance is doubly true for the Keyblade, which, along with being a fantastic concept and design, is probably the single most important inanimate object in the Kingdom Hearts universe, quite literally being the key and gatekeeper to other worlds. And as such, much more of the narrative hinges around the weapon, more so I would say actually than any other game we've seen come out of Square. It's also prudent that the Keyblade is not unique to Sora necessarily, but rather a number of them manifest to those most worthy, meaning it takes on a sort of sentience and characteristic of its own that we haven't really seen before, particularly in these sorts of Square, JRPG video games. It's also just worth noting of the weapon that I really love the various designs throughout the game, and each rendition of the Keyblade design is appealing and adds an unlockable, collectible element, to them, aside from the core story. So just to wrap up on Sora, the final thing I want to note is the subtle, and it's not just Sora, but it's actually the three core characters of Destiny Island, which is Sora, Riku, and KAIRI. There's a thematic and etymological quality to their names. So Sora, for example, is the Japanese root word for sky, and Riku is the Japanese word for land, and KAIRI, or Kai, is a derivative of the Japanese word for ocean. So I found this really neat because it's about their inherent triangulation and relationship with one another. They make up these three primal elements of matter, earth, land and sea and sky. So I find this pretty interesting symbolism, which is undulating beneath the surface and hinting at their intrinsic connection to one another. So moving on to Riku now, I think he's an interesting character to consider next, simply due to his proximity to both the hero Sora and the antagonist Ansem. Riku is this moral grey area that bridges light and dark and epitomises the notion that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. he's confident, and being a year or so older than Sora and KAIRI, he tends to have a degree of hubris, thinking he knows best a lot of the time, which makes him, I think, quite malleable to the game's antagonists, because of course pride and hubris is one of the 7 sins. And due to these characteristics, Riku reminds me of characters like Cypher from Final Fantasy VIII, who are not fundamentally bad, but rather misunderstood and somewhat flexible, or at least gullible enough to compromise their moral compass. Riku and Sora both set out to save KAIRI, but go about it in very different ways. Riku's also a victim of circumstance and what I'd term second best syndrome, I guess you could call it. Like Squall, who's praised as the champion of Garden, Sora is chosen as the champion of the Keyblade. And so the restlessness and angst and potential jealousy found in both Cypher and Riku boils over and has them make quite dubious moral decisions, particularly when there's a sorceress, such as Edea on the one hand, and Maleficent on the other, kind of whispering in their ear and manipulating them towards the darkness. Early in the game, in fact, from the opening moments, Riku is intent on escape from Destiny Island. He's increasingly restless, in part perhaps because he feels physically restrained by being stuck on a juvenile island, and to this end I think it's significant that the Final Fantasy characters are presented as children on Destiny Island. But more subtly perhaps, the relative newcomer, which is KAIRI, has awoken some sort of latent emotion in him, whether it's directed towards KAIRI or jealousy that she might be taking his friend Sora away. I think this creates the uncomfortable triangle between himself, his best friend Sora, and KAIRI, wherein Riku is clearly kind of jealous about the bond being established here. Indeed, his mismanagement of his impatient and cynical emotions and his desire to escape his situation is noted by KAIRI early on, and she says to Sora in confidence that perhaps they should take the raft and leave the island without Riku, which in a curious way is actually breathing life into his jealous fears, which is, fundamentally being deprived of his friend and being left alone. Later in the game, Riku's gradual decline in morality contrasts starkly with Sora, particularly during the Monstro segment, wherein Riku seeks to trade Pinocchio's life for KAIRI's. And, dabbling in lives and being content to trade one life for another is naturally reprehensible to Sora and the main party. So I think it's here that we reach Riku's lowest point, culminating in some pretty cool sub-boss battles actually, and Riku obtaining his own Keyblade, owing to his allegiance to the Heartless. So this growing parity between Sora and Riku is interesting, and it sets him up as, firstly it sets up his character arc for later games, but in Kingdom Hearts 1 at least, it's relatively short-lived in terms of Riku being an antagonist, and he quickly returns to the light and exits the game in a cliffhanging and sequel-inspiring fashion. So, in conclusion, despite Sora being the hero in Kingdom Hearts, I think Riku is the most relatable character, as he makes irrational and entirely human choices. He's a very flawed person, particularly compared to Sora, who's unrealistically wholesome and Disney-esque in his demeanour. Riku's pride, his confusion, mistrust and jealousy are the more relatable traits between these two characters, and his pursuit of freedom is an endeavour that I think many can empathise with, and I think it's probably the reason, in fact, he persists as a firm favourite for many within the Kingdom Hearts series. Turning now to KAIRI, she's relatively awkward to talk about in detail when it comes to Kingdom Hearts 1. She's an incredibly important character in terms of being a catalyst that propels both Sora and Riku through their respective journeys. As a Princess of Heart, KAIRI is also an integral target for Maleficent and the Disney villains, and they need her to achieve their aims. So she's both the focus, but also, due to her being captured and comatose relatively early on, she's one of the least explored character arcs throughout this first game. At worst, we could argue that Square have reverted to type when it comes to KAIRI, because she's posited as a helpless female that needs rescuing from her male counterparts. But admittedly, KAIRI or Namine develops well in later games and comes into her own by the time Kingdom Hearts 2 comes along. An interesting aspect of KAIRI's character for me is how she establishes and characterises both Sora and Riku early in the game. She was placed for experimental purposes on Destiny Island to see whether her status as a Princess of Heart would affect the Keyblade wielders. But her introduction to these two adolescent boys is interesting as it creates the, as I've previously mentioned, this subtle competition and tension between them, which escalates to become a major rift later in the first game. And particularly for Riku, it's a major point of contention for his friendship with Sora. So the awakening of desire and the discovery of the opposite sex is one of the subtler plots apparent in these three characters, and KAIRI is of course the root and the cause of that. Now, Kingdom Hearts is an innovative action RPG, and it sticks to its Final Fantasy roots with a fellowship of party members, and this party happens to consist of the unlikely pair and the next two characters I want to talk about, Donald Duck and Goofy. Now, I've been playing this game for, well over a decade, since it came out, and I can't really explain why it works. Because on paper, I remember when it was announced, in fact, it just seemed like it shouldn't work as a game. But for some reason, it really does. And although, since childhood, in fact, Donald Duck hasn't been my favourite Disney character, these guys and, escalating Donald and Goofy to kind of secondary hero status, for some reason it really kind of works and brings the game together and creates a believable and wholesome duo to assist Sora on his quest. And I think in part, this is because of the contrast in characteristics between them. And as I mentioned earlier, it creates interesting dialogue and friction between this wholesome party. Donald is intemperate and stubborn, which contrasts starkly with Goofy's laid-back and loyal demeanour. So between them they have equal pros and cons and points of discussion to propel the narrative and dialogue forward. Goofy being a dog, and obviously a dog's general characteristic is loyalty. And I think this is why Goofy wields the shield as a weapon, as in defending his master. And Donald, by contrast, in his consistent, albeit sometimes stubborn pragmatism and wisdom, wields the mage capabilities. And of course, Sora, being the hero, wields the melee weapon, analogous to the hero, which is of course the sword, or in this case the Keyblade, but it's analogous to a sword. So the balance between this pair being background characters, they don't intrude too much on the emotional, moral heart, darkness sort of storyline, the ANSEM plot, for example. But they make good background characters, and their micro interactions and plot progression is done well, because it's kept relatively in the backdrop. Yeah, which is to say they never get in the way of the primary plot line, and they help define Sora throughout the game as well, because his conversations with them establish his opinions and his demeanour and his characteristics, which, evolve over the course of not just this game, but the series. But that's not to say they're useless characters either, because, of course, they have their own plot and they have their own trajectory, which is to find the Keyblade wielder and also to find King Mickey. So this gives them some three-dimensionality and plausibility, rather than just joining Sora for no reason, as is, admittedly, is sometimes the case with Final Fantasy games. We have characters that really have quite a flaky reason for being there. Just a random example, Amarant Coral in Final Fantasy IX. I think he's a great character, he's really cool, great moveset, all of that sort of thing, but, he stuck with the party for no real reason, to be honest. But, so Kingdom Hearts and the party and Donald and Goofy kind of succeed well in doing that. Now, moving finally on to ANSEM and the Heartless. Firstly, it's worth noting that the Heartless are a fantastic game antagonist, both visually and conceptually. Everything from their elusive, shadowy movement to their purpose as the consumers of hearts is really innovative and awesome, I think, and a defining facet of the Kingdom Hearts series. Moving on to ANSEM, again, in the context of Kingdom Hearts 1, before the inevitable and sprawling narrative and convolutions of later games, he is a very strong standalone antagonist, I think, and Billy Zane brings this guy to life with enigmatic and cryptic monologues, and his patronising and immoral ends are classic Final Fantasy megalomania, brought to the PlayStation 2 generation console. So, lacking the camp demeanour of many male antagonists to come out of Square's RPGs, such as Kuja, Kefka and Seymour, ANSEM is much more aligned with the likes of Sephiroth in terms of his calculated psychopathy and this brooding, literal kind of heartlessness, which I think is really cool and adds a lot of weight to this game. Despite the fact that ANSEM is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of Kingdom Hearts' wider narrative, it's worth stating he is the perfect foundation for introducing the series. Introducing the concept of the Heartless and introducing the myriad of worlds that they seek to consume. Along with Maleficent, he grooms Riku, chastises Sora, and kind of strings along the Disney villains, including Maleficent as well. And he does this all mysteriously robed for much of the game, making him this curious enigma and one of the driving factors behind the player wanting to progress through these worlds and story. So, discussing ANSEM in isolation of the wider Kingdom Hearts narrative and subsequent games is somewhat difficult, as his true identity and nature and his status as a Heartless only becomes clear later. But within the context of the first game, it's interesting for the player, particularly with the side quests such as finding the ANSEM reports, where his name is tallied to the apparently good-natured and inquisitive ANSEM the Wise. As discussed earlier, ANSEM is the perfect avatar for the doppelganger and fragmented realities explored in the series, and propels the darker themes forward, against the good-hearted, Disney-esque nature of the game. His raison d'etre is straight out of the Final Fantasy textbook. Darkness, conquest, controlling the worlds, is something most megalomaniac antagonists pursue in Square titles. And ANSEM does so with a certain pseudo-philosophy about life emerging from and returning to darkness, which is a woolly, Disney-esque sort of masochism, if nothing else. But it makes for some really cool, albeit slightly nonsensical monologues. But for the high level, kind of philosophy and of an action game like Kingdom Hearts, we can forgive the listless philosophy employed by its antagonists, providing they look and sound cool, I think, which ANSEM certainly does. So that about wraps up the core characters worth discussing. Of course, we have some excellent Final Fantasy inclusions, such as Cloud and Squall, and also the Disney heroes, such as Tarzan and Hercules. But to try and signify these guys as anything more than cameos and discrete components of the wider plot would be overkill, I think. Obviously, we're happy to see them, and their reimagining in terms of Nomura's design is really awesome. And he does love to throw belts and accessories on things, but that is the comfortable extent to which I think they're involved in the Kingdom Hearts story, which is fine for those purposes. The only characters that inch beyond the realm of cameo or tertiary significance, I think, are Mickey and, oddly, Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty, the latter of whom is an excellent secondary antagonist that rallies the enemies of the Disney worlds together. Indeed, Maleficent's significance is surprisingly prominent, and we discover that rather than being explicitly heartless, like ANSEM, Maleficent and her party are attempting to utilise the darkness to their own ends in accessing the Kingdom Hearts. Her alignment to the Heartless is one of a subtle power struggle, and she eventually falls prey to them, much the same way Gestahl in Final Fantasy VI falls prey to Kefka, whom he thought he could control as well. Generally speaking of the character, Sleeping Beauty was never in my top Disney movies. I think I've actually only seen it once, but the way that they've utilised and characterised Maleficent throughout this series has been absolutely fantastic. And her plot involvement sees her traverse the Disney worlds where other antagonists cannot, or generally don't. So, another core plot point of Maleficent is, of course, she also taps into Riku's insecurities early on, much like Adia manipulating Cypher in Final Fantasy VIII. She does this very effectively, but I think it's worth noting because, of course, Riku does return to the light. In these exchanges, we can see how Riku's inherent distrust is apparent of both her and the Heartless throughout his tenure as a bad guy. So, to conclude, Maleficent is a cool inclusion and a great proponent of the Disney adversaries in this game as the story unfolds. So finally, I just want to cover the audio aspect of Kingdom Hearts because I think both its music and its voice acting are worthy of note. Of course, being a collaboration with Disney and off the back of their PlayStation 1 Final Fantasy successes, Square had the wealth and the resource to hire some Hollywood talent for their voice roles, including Haley Joel Osment and Billy Zane, who both nail their roles as Sora and Ansem respectively. We also have many of the Disney characters who voiced their feature film counterparts, appearing in this game, including the guys that voiced Jafar, Aladdin, Jack Skellington, Tarzan, Hades, which lends a certain stamp of approval and official standard to the game. Amusingly, actually, James Woods, who voices Hades, apparently loves these video games and loves performing in this role. So it's good not just to see, the featuring of Hollywood actors in this series, but also their enthusiasm towards it in some cases. And I believe that he's been confirmed for, Kingdom Hearts 3 as well, which is fantastic. Moving swiftly on to the music, this game for me and many others, I think, was an introduction to the genre of J-pop. And Utada Hikaru's Simple and Clean was an excellent opening pop track for the opening FMV, and I think it sets the tone of the game really well. And this kind of young generation and this young audience that would be going into this series, I think Simple and Clean was a fantastic score to kind of introduce, at the beginning of this game. Yoko Shimomura, who also composed the excellent Final Fantasy XV soundtrack, made a brilliant series of compositions for Kingdom Hearts as well. We have pieces of music as diverse and upbeat as Traverse Town, which I mentioned earlier. And also, we have the comparatively haunting Enter the Heart, choir orchestral, which establishes the emotional narrative range, basically, of Kingdom Hearts. And although, honestly, I could opine at length about Shimomura's qualities as a composer, particularly being a female composer, actually, coming out of Japan, where I think, there's still the patriarchy is still very much in place in that country. But, the quality she's brought to the forefront of video game composition is on a par, dare I say it, with Nobuo Uematsu. So, yeah, the Kingdom Hearts soundtrack is fantastic, and I may well go and listen to it today, actually. So, yeah. So, wrapping up here, Kingdom Hearts is a fantastic crossover title that expanded into a sprawling franchise, as we've seen, that rivals behemoths such as Final Fantasy itself. The first game established a solid world setting and narrative context in terms of light versus dark, which prevails to this day over the course of, several console generations and various devices. So, thanks for listening, and as always, if you like my content, I appreciate a like, a share, or subscribe, which will keep you notified of my latest episodes, and it also helps promote my channel, which is great for me. And of course, as always, feel free to drop a comment below and start a conversation, because, I love having discussions about, thoughts, theories, and opinions regarding this game.